Good evening, everyone. So our session is started officially. We were here before 6. Welcome, everyone. Uh, we'll wait for others also, for 5 minutes, and we'll start with the session. And session is recorded. Also, we are streaming live on YouTube. Uh, so whoever misses or joins later can uh, take a quick look at the session, what happened before they join. Yesterday we had a session by Ashwin. I think most of us here attended that session. That session is live streamed on YouTube. Maybe you can visit Shiv Shankar's YouTube channel and watch that session again. If you have any questions after that, you can ask questions on Coastal Karnataka Bird Watchers Network Facebook. Will accept the questions. We can have a discussion there on that Facebook channel. So we are 26 people now. So let us start the session. Uh, let's start uh, by welcoming everyone. And we have Subbu sir, Ashwin Viswanathan, and other amazing birders. I would like to welcome everyone with our team, organizing team of bigger team of Coastal Karnataka Birdwatcher Network. We have a small organizing team of 3 people. Myself, Shiv Shankar, and Prashant Krishna. So we have organized pelagic birds from Mangalore, of course, before. And to know more about these pelagic birds and movement, we had a session yesterday. And today we are having a session on identification of skuas by Dipu. So also one more upcoming session is on 7th May by Ramit, uh, like pelagic birds and pelagic birding in India and Tasmania. We'll send out. Please help us to reach out more people about this session. And to start this session, I would like to welcome our guest speaker, Dipu, today. Uh, Thank you, Dipu, for accepting our request and doing this session on identification of skuas. So, Dipu started watching birds in his school days. Uh, After he started watching birds in his backyard, his inspiration to start bird watching, like me, is K.K. Neelakantan's book, uh, Pakshigalude Adbhuta Prapancham, that book. Similarly, for me, Purnachandra Tejasvi inspired bird watching like so many of us. There are many regional groups which inspired us in this the journey of citizen science of or a bird watching journey. So he was a like a hobby birder or a passionate bird watcher in Kerala or in his backyard before moving to Bangalore. Once he moved to Bangalore in 1991, he settled there. And after this online bird watching community or smaller bird watching communities in different cities started, he took part in the like a Bangalore bird. There is a group, I think, Facebook and WhatsApp BNG birders. In that bird watching group he participated, and even Kerala bird watching network he participated. He took part in that bird watching network and communities. He also did so many pelagic bird watching from Indian South Indian coast since 2010. uh, as I remember, when I did my first bird watching off coast, when I saw Skua, everyone shouted Skua, Skua, Skua. And uh, after that, okay, we are doubtful of this Skua. Only Dipu can identify these Skuas. I was hearing his name since then. So I got to know. I haven't met Dipu personally. I'm hoping to meet him personally soon. And yesterday, Dipu participated in a session, and he answered few of the questions, and hoping that everyone will enjoy this session. And over to Deepu. I think you are muted.
Okay, yeah, thanks Gopal Krishna for that introduction. It was a long introduction, and maybe we can keep it short. Just to a couple of numbers and things to make sure that we are right on all accounts. So I moved to Bangalore in 1999, and from then on I am in Bangalore. And yeah, when we started when I started going out with the stalwarts in Bangalore, including Subbu, who is here, we did not have Facebook and WhatsApp, but we had a plain old mechanism of notifying people through postcards, and then the email era came, and groups, the mailing groups started, and I think it's similar to the journey of how communications have changed over the years. I think now bird watching has moved, also adapted to the technology. So yeah, it was at the time I could meet all the great birders who are in Bangalore, and that helped me to hone my to gain more knowledge and get to know birds more closely. So thanks to all those people in my life in different times, I've been enjoying bird watching and have enjoyed going out for both land and pelagic birds. So thanks to all of those people, and thanks to you guys for giving me this opportunity to talk here. So let's directly go into the topic of today's stuff. So let's start with identification of Jaeger. So there is a small correction that I would like to make in the title. So we put the title as identification of skuas. And if you had attended yesterday's session by Ashwin, you would have noticed that there are two types of skuas that we call. So there are the small set of skuas, which are also called as Jaegers in the newer field guides. In olden times or olden field guides and books, they were called skuas, but recently they have been called Jaegers more often than skuas. And then there are the big birds, which are much bigger than these Jaegers, which are retained, which are still called skuas. So we have three Jaegers which visit Indian coast, as we saw yesterday: Pomeranian Jaeger, parasitic Jaeger, and long-tail Jaeger. Let's, for simplicity, let's call skuas in this session, because I also prefer that compared to Jaeger. So we have Pomeranian Arctic, which is also the same as parasitic, and long-tail skuas. These are the three smallest skuas. And then we have the big skuas, out of which it's a taxonomy is complicated, so there are multiple species there, but out of which what we are concerned, or generally what we have seen till now, are South Polar skua and brown skua. Their sightings are very rare and much less in number. So in this session, we will focus mostly on the smaller skuas, and we'll just touch upon the bigger skuas. And our exposure to the bigger skuas are much less. So even today, if we get a brown skua candidate, it's tough for us to identify. We take help of experts from Australia and New Zealand who are much familiar with this. So that's an area which we are still not, we have not really got an opportunity to say study more. So let's kick it off with the smaller skuas or Jaegers. So as we said, there are three of them. But if you look at the field guides, or slightly older field guides especially, you will see that most of them don't even mention long-tailed skua. And they typically stop with parasitic or Arctic skua and Pomeranian skua. And if you look at, this is Rasmussen's initial first version of field guide, and you see that, yeah, there are some illustrations of birds, and you would say why it is so different. You can see that there is a bird which has very nice long pointed tail, and there is another bird which always shows non-pointed tail. Quite simple, right? So any bird which you see with this tail with a long point should be a parasitic Jaeger, and whatever you see with a non-pointy tail, this should be a Pomeranian skua. It doesn't matter whether it is breeding, non-breeding. So everything looks quite easy here. Maybe juveniles are a little bit tricky, but yeah, maybe that for many other birds as well, that would be the case. So maybe if you just focus on the adults and older birds, possibly this could be easy. That is the impression that you get when you look at this field guide. And even when you look at the descriptions, yeah, adult has short pointed tail streamers. That's it from a field guide point of view. And adult has diagnostic spatulate tail streamers. So that's what we see normally in the field guide. And similarly, if you go to the InSkip guide, again, those older InSkip illustrations, you see that something similar, right? So you see some Pomeranian Jaegers, which is on top here, and they are showing some fairly broad tail streamers. And then you look at Arctic skua, you see that there are pointed tail streamers. Yeah, maybe there is a little bit more description here in terms of how variations could happen. So, and they give some simplistic pointers like, yeah, adult non-breeding has an indistinct cap and barring to breast and upper and undertail coverts, uniform dark underwing distinguished from birds in first and second wave plumage. And there are some small pointers which are given here to actually distinguish about the double wing flash that Pomeranian has. And then from a parasitic point of view, we say that adult non-breeding is as Pomeranian but has pointed tail tip. That's all what it says here, right? And juvenile is more variable, possibly, and can have some rufous tinge. So looking at this, we may think that this is easy. You just look at the tail and then do this identification. And if you look at the pictures here also, you see that from first look you will say, oh, Pomeranian generally has a much stronger breast band, and Arctic looks like not showing that breast band. And then the tail, look at the tail. That's it, and you should generally be able to identify these birds. Now I can show you actual images from the field. So this is how it looks from real images in the field. So you could see that whatever is shown there sometimes may work, sometimes may not work. In these cases, you can see that some of these images do have pointed tail, and some of them may or may not have pointed tails. And you can have birds which are showing no central tail feathers. And you could see that these are all photos from the field. which we have. So tail feathers, if you see in wintering, we may or may not be able to use them as a ID pointer at all, because these birds molt their tail feathers in our Indian, from when they are wintering in the Indian coast, right? So this is how they look in terms of in terms of their appearance in when they are wintering in our in Arabian Sea or Indian Ocean or Bay of Bengal, wherever they are. So if you see the overall patterns that you see, clean patterns that you saw in the field guide, this is not what we are typically going to see in the field. So in the field, you will see quite a lot of variations. So you could see these are all upper part variations where you could have a uniform upper parts. There could be scaling. Some birds could show very scant barring on the upper tail covered. Some could show very prominent barring on the upper tail coverts. Similarly, if you look at a view from the bottom, some of them may show plain underparts without much marking. Then there could be birds which are marked a little bit heavily, some which are intermediate, minor markings, but some of them could show prominent breast band, some of them may not show breast band, and some of them could show solid gray breast band instead of barrings and markings. Some could be spottings. So, and now you look at other set of birds, again, similar things, right? So you could have different levels of scaling. Upper tail barrings are there. Upper tail barring could vary. Similarly, undertail barring could also vary. And you could have some of the birds could be very darkish looking. Some of them could be pale. And so there could be any amount of variation among these birds, from very pale morph birds to dark morph birds. So as you go and see you go out into the sea and start seeing skuas, you will appreciate the variation that you can see in these birds. Every individual is going to be unique. So these are not birds that we typically see. For example, you take a common myna or a parakeet or a common bird, right? Every individual looks similar. Fairly very similar, that if you see two individuals in the field on a day within an hour span of half an hour, you will not be able to be certain, or you will not be certain, you cannot be certain that they are the same individual or they are different individuals, right? Unless you really know that they are separated by a big distance, you are not sure. But for skuas, if you see here, right, as you see here, every bird is have their own individual variations, and they can vary from very pale morph birds to very all dark, fully dark birds like what you're seeing here. So this type of variations is something that make these skuas very unique, and it also makes the identification very difficult. One good you can come back and actually find out the different individuals and mark them one by one, and you can say that yes, this is the individual that we saw at 10 o'clock and it has come back again at 12 o'clock because the way that they look is each individual look is different, and from those markers in terms of their body markings and wing the molt stage, etc., you could actually individually identify these birds. So now coming to the point of identification. So now we see that these skuas are highly variable. So how do we identify, right? What could be the pointers that we can use? So before going into the identification, do you guys want to, I want to keep it interactive. So do you guys want to, you can open up your mic as long as there are no background disturbances. So do you guys want to attempt guessing what these birds are? Unless you have seen the paper, though, somebody who has not seen the paper and don't remember, of course, you can try to attempt. What are these birds? So for example, what are these birds? Which skuas are these?
I have it muted for many of them. If just to avoid any disturbances, if they like to raise a question, they can raise their hand or put the question in chat. Maybe at the end I will unmute all so
Sure.
that I can ask the questions. So if
Sure.
that is fine, otherwise I can unmute others.
Yeah, I think if somebody wants to try guessing these what these birds are, you can feel free, and if you want to see how it goes, then we can do that. Otherwise, we can talk on some of these birds, and we can try to see how we actually tackle this problem of identifying these skuas, right? Okay, what I've done is I've selected a set of skuas of different species here. All these birds that we see here are Arctic skuas or parasitic skua. They are showing different upper part patterning, right? And if you look at the same 2 slides later, this is the set of skuas which shows upper part patterning again, and these are Pomeranian skuas. So you can see that fairly their upper part variation, like what you could expect from any bird, is similar, right? Some could be plain, some could have shown some scalings, some could show some white in the wing due to the molt, others could be pretty clean. And you go back and you see Arctic skua, very similar. Some could be clean, some could show scalings. And in terms of your upper tail barring and extent of variation there, it's all fairly similar. So one of the important thing to remember in skua identification is that some of these, or most of these body part patterns are not really useful in identification as we think. So they are part of their individual variation. So you need to go a little bit more into the structure and some of that finer points which would actually help us come to the right ID. So in terms of the size, parasitic Jaeger is actually somewhere, or parasitic skua is somewhere in the middle in terms of size and bulk. Pomeranian skua is the bulkiest, and long-tail skua is the smallest. So in terms of field impression, this could actually give some idea of what bird it is. So when you see in the field a flight of a gull versus a turn, or a big turn versus a small turn, you could see some slight differences in the way that they fly, right? Something similar could apply here, especially if you are looking at Pomeranian versus long-tail, because they are showing they're at the extremes. Pomeranian is really big and long-tailed is relatively small, really small. But the problem comes with parasitic, because they are lying in the intermediate area where they could reach somewhat to the size of Pomeranian, but they could also be overlapping with long-tailed. So one of the things that you could, of course, look in the field is how a bird is flying. Is it a heavy flight or is it a light flight, right? So smaller terns have a light buoyant flight, while heavier gulls and terns have a much more labored flight. Something similar can be used in the field when you are looking at these birds, but all such things come with caveats in terms of these birds. For example, all these flight patterns could also be dependent on the conditions in the sea at the time, whether there is a wind and how strong is the wind, and which direction they are flying, and even what purpose they are flying, right? Based on this, these birds also vary the way that they fly. So use with caution, but that could be a first thing that you could use when you are in the field to see which bird it could be or which species it could be, right? So that is, and that has nothing to do with any of the plumage pattern. What you're seeing here is not what matters. What is the feel that you get in the field when you watch a bird flying is what matters there. And once you see the bird, of course, then typically what we do is we take a lot of photographs and we try to observe the bird in the field, and then we many times we come back and then do identification post the trip. Why is that? Why is it so? Because the same complexities that we mentioned, right? We may not be able to fully identify a skua in the field, and that's okay. What I feel is that you don't need to identify every bird, and therefore there are many birds which we still leave as unidentified if we don't get the right pointers. And what we look for is multiple different pointers to match so that we can actually be confident about our ID. So for skuas, that is very, very important. Generally, do not try to identify based on one pointer or two. Try to stack up as many pointers as possible for the skuas, and then you will feel, say, if you don't get any contrasting pointers, then you can be more confident of your ID. So of course, now coming to the after the point of gist and your impression of how heavy and how big the bird is, the next thing that you could of course use in the field itself is about the central tail feathers. So if you see here, as the guides show, the central tail feathers do aid in identification with some caveats. So your central tail feathers, if it is long and pointed, then this is an indication that this skua is most probably not a Pomeranian skua. So that is one thing that you can deduce. But remember that Pomeranian skuas can show, so this is a set of Pomeranian skuas which are showing their upper parts and under parts. If you see here, you could see that Pomeranian skuas sometimes may have either dropped central tail feathers, in which case you don't even see central tail feathers, or there could be broken central tail feathers, in which case they could look like pointing central tail feathers. So this is something that you always need to eliminate if you are looking at a central tail feather, and if it is available for we are viewing is available in the field for viewing clearly, or if it is there in the photographs, this is something that you can check. And one other thing that you need to remember is that this long central tail pointed central tail feather, pointed central tail feather, is also shared by long-tailed jaeger or long-tailed skua. So if you see, these are a set of long-tailed skuas. So here you can see the same central tail pointed like parasitic skua. So here again, there are two candidates. If you see a long central tail feathers, which is very clear, it could be an Arctic or parasitic skua, or it could be a long-tailed skua. So, and if you really are able to see a much more broader tail, central tail feathers like this, right, like a spoon, that could actually clinch your ID as a Pomeranian, because both the other skuas do not show a spatula or a spoon-shaped central tail feather, unless there are really some, basically a broken long pointed central tail feather could give some broad-endedness, but it will still not look like a spoon-shaped feather, central tail feather like this. But of course, you can see when they are growing up, in some angles, you could think that you may think that these are not spoon-shaped and it is pointed. Normally when they have this reasonably long central tail feathers, they show a spoon-shaped structure based on which you could actually identify it as a Pomeranian skua. But that happens typically only during the early winter, that is, say when they are arriving in our waters, for example, in September and October timeframe, and towards end of the season, right, winter season, which is around March, April. So during this time, you may be able to use central tail feathers as a ID pointer for Pomeranian skua. But in between, they molt these central tail feathers, and that is a time when you may see them without a central tail feather or a broken central tail feathers, where then you cannot make a confident ID as Pomeranian skua. But we need to now look for other parameters. So the next one was so after the gist and the overall build, we tried to look at the central tail feathers in the field, and if we could make some progress there, we could identify a Pomeranian skua. But if you have pointed central tail feathers, or you don't really have central tail feathers and they are under molt, and what else you could look, right? So one thing that you could look at is in terms of the under, there are, before coming to that part, I would like to focus on one point, saying that these skuas take around 3 years to become adults. So the juveniles in their first year look slightly or very different from the adults. As you can also see from the field guides, they would have depicted juveniles with a lot of scaling and marking, and they take 3 years to get adulthood. So what is the big difference, or how do we identify a bird as an immature bird or an adult bird, is based on the underwing coverts. So when I say underwing coverts, this is the area that we are talking about. So this underwing coverts are solid dark in adult birds, but they show some amount of barring when they are immature birds. The amount of barring depends on the age. So a first year bird or a first cycle bird will show a heavily barred underwing coverts, and second cycle bird will show a little bit less. And the third cycle bird should show very less underwing barring, and then when they reach adulthood, the underwing coverts become solid dark like this. So it is actually easy to age a skua as an immature or an adult than finding which species it is. So what you could first do is to check the skua and figure out whether it is an adult or not. For example, here you can see this is a first cycle skua. So you can see how the underwing coverts are heavily barred, right? And as it grows and as it ages, you can see how the underwing barring is becoming less and less pronounced, and you have more plain sections in the underwing coverts. And when they finally attain the adulthood, you can see that the whole underwing is plain dark. So you could first you could age the bird, and because that is something that you can actually observe in the field. After you look at the bird, you look at the central tail feathers, you also look at the undertail coverts, right? And then you can see that these birds are adults or immatures. And based on whether a bird is adult or immature, how you go about the ID may also be slightly different.
There is a question from Prasad in chat box. He is asking, does the underwing coverts pointer apply for all 3 species of small skuas?
Yeah, all 3, it applies for all 3 species. The only caveat, again, every rule has an exception. The only difference is in terms of dark morph birds. When a bird is dark morph, the underwing covert barring is cannot be relied upon for aging as we can do it in pale morph birds. Yes, the juveniles, or basically the first cycle birds, do show some sort of barring even in dark morph birds, but as they grow up, right, they lose that barring very often. So a dark morph bird is very difficult to identify compared to pale morph bird. So that is something that you have to always remember. So you can use underwing coverts for any pale morph bird to age them reliably, but dark morph birds, we need to be careful. So now if we know the age of the bird, then we can do some sort of say, you can say a decision tree, right? So adults generally show all, as we just discussed, show a very dark, plain dark underwing coverts, and they have some set of pointers which we can use. And especially if you find that a bird is first cycle, you need to use a slightly different set of pointers for further identification. So that is where this aging actually helps. In terms of what you can see in the field. So what you can typically see in the field is, of course, what we discussed is the structure and the way that they fly, possibly how the central tail feathers are, and how the underwing is structured, right? With these are typically what you get in field. You don't really get too much of time to observe a skua which is in flight or in the field, because you may get a quick view of how they're flying about and doing the chasing of turns, etc. So with these, it may be a little bit tricky to identify. So we always use most of the time we need to use additional static images, right? You take photos and then look at it to see next set of features that we can use. So we'll start now. A couple of them we could go by easy ones first, and then we can go to a little bit tricky ones later. In terms of easy one, you can see that this long tail, this is a set of long tail skuas. So if you see from a patterning, you won't see much of a difference. They have also show sometimes breast bands, they also show barrings, they could be plain, they may show different level of darkness in their head, etc. All of these things are variable. But what you can see is that all juvenile skuas shows a pale tarsi. So basically this, the leg, right? The visible portion of the leg here, which is pale. So that tarsi, image a juvenile bird or first cycle bird show a pale tarsi. But if it is an adult bird and if it shows a pale tarsi, it is a long-tailed skua, because only long-tailed skuas shows pale tarsi when they are an adult. So you can see all these birds, right? Whenever, if you look at the tarsi in any photo that is visible, you can see that it will be pale for a long-tailed skua, irrespective of their age. But if you go back to a Pomeranian or parasitic, you can see that, you can see the dark legs. Their legs becomes darker as they age. So if you are looking at an adult or an older immature, at least say third cycle, so in some of the second cycles and third cycles and adults, they all show dark tarsi. So if you are seeing a very light, a pale tarsi in an adult or an older immature bird, then you can be fairly certain that the bird that you are seeing is a long-tailed skua. So this is one reliable pointer that you can use. And both Arctic and Pomeranian skuas show dark tarsi as they grow, right? But this cannot be used in first cycle birds, which are which are slightly different from these older immatures and adults. So that's one pointer to separate now long-tailed skua from parasitic, even if you see the central tail feathers are pointed in both, right? So you could use that leg as a very reliable pointer to identify. Now, now the rest of the pointers that we are talking about are all a little bit difficult or variable, but they can be used, but you should always use caution when we are using them, and always corroborate with other features. So one of the things that you can all notice in this initial set of parasitic Jaeger pictures is that tend to show a pale base at the, a pale dot at the base of their beak. See, for example, you see these birds, you could see that there is many of these birds show a pale dot or a pale spot at the base of the beak. So this may be visible in many birds, but of course there are birds like this in which you will not be seeing it, especially when they are into their breeding plumage. You won't see it. In their non-breeding plumage, many of them show a pale base to the beak, upper mandible. You can see that in all these birds seen here, right? You could see that many of them show a pale base. Now, if you look at the Pomeranian skuas, you don't see such a pale spot, but see here you could see there is some amount of paleness on the way, because of the way the head is structured. So that is the variability that we are talking about. So if you are seeing a pale spot at the base of the beak, there is a good chance that you are looking at an Arctic skua. So if you look at the long-tailed, this is again set of long-tailed skuas. So here also you can see that the pale spot is missing on most of the birds. But of course you could have birds which have completely pale head or some pale mottling in front. So those are the things that we should actually take care. So that's why I said this pointer is not an absolute pointer. This pointer is a slightly tricky pointer, but it would give us an indication whether this could most probably be an Arctic skua or not. So that is one thing. And now staying on the beak part again. So there is a slight difference in the way that the beak size is and how the beak will appear. So typically, since Pomeranian is the biggest skua, you could also see that the beak is fairly big and bulky in a Pomeranian. But if you look at an Arctic or even a long-tailed, your beak is slightly longish, or you can say it's not, rather than bulky, you would feel it's long, and it's not that bulky. But this is again a relative stuff, right? You should be very, very careful when you are using this beak structure. But many times with the overall structure of the bird being bulky and the beak being bulky, you would be able to have some idea, or it will be a pointer to say that this bird is a Pomeranian. But in terms of long-tail skua, again, overall the bird is small. So sometimes if you don't have anything to compare with, right, you may feel that beak is bulky. But on an absolute scale or with real measurements, of course, their beaks are smaller. But they can sometimes appear to be a little bit bulky in long-tailed. But in general, long-tailed and parasitic will show smaller or leaner looking beaks compared to a Pomeranian skua. Overall, if you look at the body structure, also very similar observation you can make. You can see that any Pomeranian skua that you see, generally you will feel it's a bulky bird, right? So the body is really the bulk of the bird. So you can see it's a big pot-bellied or big-bodied structure. It all depends on the flight and the angle as well. So for example, there are two similar images here, one on the left and one on the right. The right, you can see it's more like a bottle, right? Fairly uniform, bulky shape. But on the left side, you will see it is a little bit more tapered. So it also depends a little bit on the angle and the individual bird. But most of the Pomeranians, you will feel as you will see that the bird is a bulky-bodied bird and a heavy bird, compared to say a Pomeranian, sorry, a parasitic or a long-tailed skua, where you can see that it's not really, it's more of a peaked appearance, right? Your belly is peaks and on both sides it tapers down. It's not like a bottled appearance, but it's more of a tapered appearance on both sides. But of course, the angle matters. See, for example, this bird may not appear that tapered. But again, the field and with pictures, you should be able to look at multiple pictures and assess this to see whether that is consistent across different angles and pictures. And then you can see whether the bird can be described as a bulky, big-bodied bird or not. So that is a pointer that we can use, but again, with a little bit of caution. So I have seen parasitic Jaegers which really look bulky at some point of time, and we may think they look like Pomeranian, but then other features point to an Arctic skua. So we say that, okay, that may be a slight individual variation. And if you come to the long-tailed skua back, again, you see that it is again a small bird. You will always feel a long-tailed skua as a very light bird, like comparing like a smaller tern versus big tern, right? Same thing. So you can see that they have a very long tapered back, and their body tapers towards their back. And this appearance is there in most of the angles. But of course, you see this one bird right here. Again, it goes against the wisdom. This doesn't look that tapered. And again, I think it's an individual and the angle that contributes to it. So here it looks like a bottle, a bulky body, but actually the bird is a small bird. So you should use this along with your field observations and multiple angles to make sure that you don't really make a decision just based on one angle and one picture, right? So that's something that we need to be careful about. And in terms of coloration, generally long-tailed has a little bit more grayish color to the upper parts, but these are very difficult sometimes, and even with images, right? And sometimes it's tough because it all depends on how you process the image, and a gray may become brown the way you process. So we generally don't depend on the colors unless it is very obvious that this bird is having a very drastic color difference compared to another bird which is browner, and a long tail is sitting next to it, which is grayer. So then, so now we talked about a couple of points. First, we talked about the size and overall gist that we get in the field. Next, we talked about the central tail feathers. Then we talked about the color of the legs, which could give us an idea in terms of long tail. Then we talked about the pale spot in front of the base of the upper mandible. And then we talked about overall structure of the beak and in terms of the body. And the structure of head is also something which similar that we can use. Parasitic or Arctic skua will show a more pointed triangular type of head. This is a little bit difficult to get it because again it depends a lot on the angle. So you can see it's more of a pointed triangular, right? head here versus a Pomeranian, which sometimes shows a more bulky head, right? It's not as triangular as you would expect in an Arctic, but head is a little bit bulkier. But use it with caution. The more and more you look at skuas, the more you will start appreciating that slight difference in the head structure. But don't use it as a primary ID pointer, but use it more as a secondary pointer, which is obvious in multiple images, right? So even long-tailed gives a slightly different feeling when you look at the head, though it is again pointed somewhat similar to parasitic. You could many times appreciate or see the fact that a long tail gives you a very short-necked appearance compared to a parasitic, which is a moderately long head projection that comes out from the edge of the wings, right? So typically long tail will give you a short necked appearance and a cuter face because of the smaller bird being it being a smaller bird. So that's something that you could look out if you want to target a long tail skua. So these are the typical pointers that we typically use in terms of plumage, except, okay, I forgot one thing. So a couple of other things that that again can be added as secondary pointers is about underwing flash. So that is being talked about even in field guide. So what is this underwing flash that we are talking about? So this is how the underwing of a parasitic or Arctic skua look like when it is in breeding plumage, where it shows an all dark underwing coverts. I'm talking about an adult here. And then it has the primaries, which are dark at their, say, most of the feathers are dark, or the feathers, most of the length of the feather is dark, but at the base and the base of those feathers, they show a pale area, which comes as more like an arc, right? Pale flash. So this is how an Arctic looks like, but beware that during the molt, right? And because the feathers, as they age, their coloration may change. So that's why something it has to be used with caution. But normally we can see that an Arctic, this is how an Arctic skua's wing look like, where you have a pale flash at the base of primaries. Now, if you look at the same similar angles for a Pomeranian skua, you can see that the base of the primaries are pale and the base of the primary coverts are also pale. So you could see a double flash here. So double wing flash or double wing slash or arcs you can see, right? So the base of the primaries is prominently whitish and the base of the primary coverts is also whitish. Maybe not be as prominent as the base of primaries, but it is still white enough to show you two white pale flashes here, right? So you can see that sometimes you can obviously see it here. So here again, you can see those three layers, right? Fully dark, then there is a layer of pale, slightly pale based primary coverts, and then paler based primaries. But sometimes it will not be very visible, like this bird here or this bird here, where it is not that clearly visible. And very rarely, some of the parasitics may also show this type of two double wing slashes. So beware of the fact that this is a little bit tricky feature, but if you see it well and if you're fairly confident that that is really consistent across multiple images, then that would be a pointer for Pomeranian. And in long tail, on the other hand, what you see is that this whole pale flash is all completely reduced, especially in adults. You will see a all dark wing like this. So adult in breeding plumage. So again, this need to be checked on birds based on the condition of feathers. In fresh feathers, when they are getting into the breeding plumage, yes, if you don't see any pale flash at all, then it is it's a good indication for you to say that you consider this bird as long-tailed. But always remember that when fresh feathers are coming up in Arctic skua as well, they may appear all dark and the pale in the base of primaries will be very reduced. So there should be some double confirmation of how exactly it looks like. But on an average, on an adult bird, if you look, the amount of pale in the underwings of long-tailed skua is very, very minimal. But as I said, right, aging has some differences here. you can see that on a mature or a first cycle long-tailed skua, there is a pale flash, and these pale flashes are similar to what you see in Pomeranian and Arctic skuas. But from their second cycle onward, mostly they show very reduced pale flashes, which is an indicator that you can use to identify the bird as long-tailed skua candidate. Then there are features which are mentioned in detailed papers about the paleness of primary shaft. So that if you see that you have to check again on the upper wing when we are seeing the upper wing primaries, right? So you can see that in these birds, these are the upper primaries view. So if you see here, the shaft of this primary feathers are all pale. You can see these pale lines, right? 4 or 5 lines here. You can see in all these birds 4 or 5 lines, except this bird here, which is having a one old feather, which is getting to be molted, and these are new feathers. So the new feathers are showing very reduced pale shaft, and the old one is showing very prominent pale shaft. So this is a feature that this pale shafts is a feature, something that you can use to distinguish between long-tailed skua and the other two. In a fresh or a reasonably fresh wing primary feathers, because as they grow older, these feathers become worn, and even in long-tailed skua, these feathers primary shafts became pale. So if you see here, this is what we are talking about. In long-tailed skua, only the last two outer primary feathers will show a prominent pale shaft. Others may not be prominent. Though they may be, we can see a shaft there, slightly paler shaft, but they are not whitish, right? But as I said, right, once the feathers become worn and in their late winter, you can see primary shafts like this, where though this is a long-tailed skua, you can see that many of primary feathers show a paler shaft. And you can see this in multiple birds here. Some birds you can see that outer two are very prominent and others are not, but in other birds you can see that they all show pale primary shafts. So this is something that again you should use with caution. But if you are sure that you can reliably see the state of primary feathers, then this is a feature that you can use. On the Pomeranian and parasitic, you can see that these are normally pale for almost all the outer primary feathers from 5 to 10, right? Most of them will show primary pale shaft. And on the also, as we just discussed, right, when we use this feature, be careful, as fresh feathers on Arctic again will show reduced pale shafts sometimes, and may not look that prominently white on the inner primaries. So that could give you some indicate or some basically indication of it being similar to a long tail, but that should be checked with care as to whether we are looking at freshly growing feathers, or are we looking at the feathers which have grown and have a few days old or few weeks old. By the time after they are a few weeks old or a few months old, then by the time they will show a much more consistent pattern that like we discussed, both Arctic and the Pomeranian will show a lot of pale flashes in their outer primaries, and long tail will show pale shaft only for the last two outer primaries. So other features like undertail coverts and upper tail coverts, which are typically mentioned in books as some of sometimes aiding to identify, I have found that most of them may not be reliable for wintering birds. So many of these birds show different patterns, and in terms of their upper tail coverts and undertail coverts, and even upper wing and the way they molt and showing the paleness on upper wing, or the scaling on upper wings, or the breast barring or the underpart colorations, and the way that they are barred or spotted. All these things are have been found very variable. In all these three species, we could find very plain underbodied birds to very dark birds with varying amount of spotting and barring on their underparts and scaling on their upper parts. So Normally, we don't really use any of those plumage features like underbody barring or under tail and upper tail barring, etc. for identification. We try to use whatever features that we just mentioned till now, right? Those are a little bit more reliable compared to these plumage features, which are highly variable. And in terms of dark morph skua, some of these features again becomes invisible, but they typically tend to show this double wing flash in a pomerine. And in terms of the bulk and the structure of the beak, etc., yes, the dark morphs retain those like features. They are similar as in pale morphs. And one other thing that we have noticed is that till now we have not really found too many dark morph, long-tailed and parasitic. Very, very rare. But pomerine tend to show a little bit more dark morph. Say basically, in pomerine we find a little bit more dark morph birds. So when you see a dark morph and a heavy bird, first check for pomerine, and then you could actually see if it is not pomerine or not. But there is a good chance that what you may be seeing is a pomerine based on understanding till now. Of course, this could change as we see more birds in the future. So those are the set of pointers that I just wanted to talk about today. So if we start from beginning again, of course, look at the structure of the bird and how it is. And that is the first clue, irrespective of the age of the bird, whether it is juvenile or immature or adult. Typically, pomerines are heavy-built birds and long tails are the nimblest birds. So there is a difference in how they fly and how they move around. So that could be a cue. And then start looking at smaller features, other features like tail, central tail feathers, the color of the legs, the structure of the beak, the pale base at the beak of the upper mandible, overall structure of the body. Then look at the wing flashes that if you can see, look at the pale flashes on the upper primaries. Yeah, I think that gives us a set of pointers with which you can actually try to go and identify skuas. So, and in terms of aging, I just added a slide on how to age. So typically the extent of barring on the underwing coverts is the primary feature for aging. The more extensive it is, the younger the bird is, the less it is, then the more closer it is to adult, and adults have all dark underwing. And of course, the extent of pale areas on legs is something that you can use to identify or age parasitic or a pomerine as young, immature or adult. At least in the first cycle birds, all of them show pale areas on legs. From second cycle onwards, the Arctic and pomerine start showing dark, much more darker areas and less paler areas on the tibia and on the tarsus. Pale tips and fringes to upper wing coverts. This is a very specific case for first cycle birds where there is a, if their upper wing coverts are showing pale tips and fringes, then that could be a first cycle birds. And from second cycle onwards, the upper wings becomes uniformly dark. And condition of flight feathers and the primary molt progress is another indication. So what happens is that the young birds which are coming to winter, right, they take a little bit more time to start their molt. So the adult birds and older immatures start their molt faster or earlier. Say some November to December, they start dropping their primary inner primaries and slowly move towards outer primaries. Similarly, secondaries start molting from both sides, and then the body feathers start molting. So this molting process starts early in the adult birds and older immatures versus a first cycle bird. First cycle bird typically starts the molt later, say December, Jan, and may complete toward May, June. But the adults and older immatures may start it in October, November, and they may finish it by March. So by March, you would see these birds finishing their molt and in a good shape and good condition. While in April or May, if you're seeing a molting bird, most probably it is going to be a it's most probably is a primary, a first cycle bird. But again, there could be slight individual variations based on the condition of the feathers and the way that the birds are, or the way they had to undergo harsh weather conditions, etc. Right. So based on that, sometimes they delay their molt or change the molt timings by a little bit. So we need to be careful, but normally that helps. And the other thing is about the shape and length of R1. So as a bird ages, this R1 is the central tail feathers. The length of the central tail feathers and the shape slightly changes. In the first cycle birds, the central tail feathers are short and normally not as pin-tailed as we see in adults, or the spoon-tailed as we see in a Pomeranian adult. They are very short, maybe an inch long or 1.5 inch max, and maybe a few centimeters in palms. And they are mostly broad-ended or slightly pointed. That's it. But from second cycle onwards, they start getting the shape becomes similar to their adult birds, but the length may be slightly less. So Pomeranian shows a spoon or a broad-ended, broad-edged and ended central tail feathers, while parasitic or Arctic Skua and long-tailed Skua shows pointed central tail feathers. So these are the features that you can use for aging. And here are some set of immature Pomeranian Skuas. So you can see, right? So this is a first year, first cycle Pomeranian Skua. You can see the central tail feathers is almost as same as other tail feathers and not really projecting, but a slight projection. And you could see that sometimes if it is broken, you could see some pointed tail feathers, but though this is looking pointed, this is actually a Pomeranian. And as they grow, they may show some slight broad-ended central tail feathers. And if you see the underwing barring, you can see that they are all showing some variable amount of underwing barring, based on which we can actually age them as first cycle, second cycle, or third cycle, depending on when you are seeing them, right? And here is an example of a dark bird. As I said, right, the underwing barring is very subdued in all ages. So this is possibly an immature because it shows a tail shape like an adult, but still shows some underwing barring here. So most probably it's a second or third cycle Pomeranian Skua here.
Dipu?
Yeah.
I have a question. See, how much of the seasonality and abundance of these skuas, 3+2 species, the 3+2 austral species, help in zeroing on the identity of the species?
Yeah, I think the three small skuas that we just talked about all are Arctic breeders. So they all come at the same time and go at the same time.
Are they found right through the year?
No, only through only wintering. So they breed in the Arctics and they come around October time frame typically. Starts from
the austral species are only monsoon visitors, isn't it?
Yeah. On the other hand, the austral species are brown skua and South Polar skua, which generally comes in our summer here. So they can be found here around our summer monsoon time, and they go back by say September, October. So that, but they will, we don't generally typically confuse those with these guys, because these are smaller skuas, and the rare confusion that can come is with a dark morph Pomeranian skua. But there also the South Polar and brown skuas are completely different in structure and different beasts. So they are huge birds. It's like looking at those large Hugolin's type of gulls, right? Large black back gulls, and you are looking at smaller gulls. You don't really get confused between them. So it's difficult.
Abundance wise, how do you rank these 5 skuas?
All now, with after we had done so many trips, we have found all these skuas, and in terms of abundance, Arctic and Pomeranian are much higher in number, especially Arctic. But long-tail is slightly lesser in number in terms of records that we have. But sometimes it could also be an issue of identification, right? We feel that some of them still do winter, though the passage is the time when actually you see more of long-tailed and Pomeranian skuas. Arctic is there all throughout the winter, and Pomeranian and long-tailed numbers increase during passage.
What do you mean by passage? Which months are we looking
at? Both autumn and spring. So you could see these birds during September, October, November time, especially Pomeranian we have seen that time, long tail we have seen. Similarly, around March, April, right?
April,
That is
yeah.
the time when they do the reverse migration. So
Yeah.
at that time, again, we see some good numbers. And in between, there could be there. It's not, we are not sure about whether they are actually wintering here or are they moving and it's only few birds that winter. But the problem is complicated by the identification, as we discussed, right? While they are in the middle of the molt, middle of the winter, they all look very similar. So unless you really go out and have a photograph and identify each and every individual and try to get the numbers like sorted out, it is possible that there are a few are still wintering. And because we have a couple of records from November, December of both long-tailed and Pomeranian skuas, and they may also be taking different niches in the sea, right? So we don't know how close each of them would like to the land, right? Or are they preferring more deeper seas? Because our pelagic trips are mostly concentrated on the shallower part of the sea, up to say 50 or 60 kilometers, right? That is where we typically monitor. But if it is beyond that area, we don't know which skuas are actually abundant and how their distribution changes. So these are some things that we would still need more studies to actually find out.
Yeah, thank you.
Dipu, there are 2-3 questions in the chat.
Sure.
The first one is from Prasad.
Yeah.
Do skuas call in flight or when disturbed? Can it be used as a pointer?
Not really. I have I've seldom seen them making calls. Even when disturbed, they don't really call and they just fly off. And I don't think there is any big difference in calls, especially even if you get one make a call like a screaming call or for whatever reason. I don't think there is any real call differences between them that you could use for identification. So that is something that we cannot use for these birds.
I think we answered Nivedita's question there. And Subbu, similar question.
Yeah.
Next one is about large skuas. Request on.
So large skuas, it's very simple. What guideline that I follow is very simple. So you can generally see two, or what we know is that at least till from historically, you can have only two skuas in our seas. One is brown skua and one is South Polar skua from old time records and washed out specimens or blown in specimens. So out of that, South Polar skua has two morphs, pale morph and a dark morph, and brown skua is always dark. So if you get a pale morph bird, it's simple. It is South Polar skua. Pale in the sense, when you say dark, it is really dark brown and pale is grayish. So you really know when you're seeing a pale bird, a pale morph bird, and it is a South Polar skua. And if it is a dark bird, a dark morph South Polar skua, it is very tough. There are only subtle differences between a dark morph South Polar skua and a brown skua, which can look very similar, and they even do interbreed. Okay, it's not that they completely are cut off from each other, but in the areas where they overlap, they do even interbreed. So you could have even hybrids between them. So it's very difficult to actually sort out a dark morph South Polar skua versus brown skua. There are differences, subtle differences, and since we don't really see those birds much, we are not really at a position to say, we can do some theoretical analysis and say that these birds could be this, but what we practically do is that we contact our friends in Australia and New Zealand, etc., where they have more experience with these birds and we get their help in actually identifying. So rather than we trying to break our head, we do some basic analysis, share with them, and then we take their help in actually IDing. So that would be the best approach as of today, at least for the big dark skuas. But the smaller ones are the ones where we have quite a good exposure now, and we are fairly confident that we can actually identify many of these things if we get good views and good photographs. But of course, there will be a lot of skuas where we need to just leave as skua species, because as we just saw, right, they are complicated set of species where the individual variation is so much. So unless you really get a good view, it is better to be safe than be wrong.
So the next question is, how useful is the flight pattern and the wing beats in identification?
Yeah, as we discussed in the beginning, right, that is one of the cue that you can take But of course, to be sure of an identity with that takes a lot of experience. If you are daily in and out watching those skuas, yes, then you can master that skill of identifying all these three skuas with their flight. But since our exposure is less, we can take it as a pointer, and the differences will be like something that you can think yourself between a big gull and a small gull, a big turn versus small turn, right? When they fly, how the differences are there. Similar things you could use to deduce whether it is more of a Pomeranian type of flight or more of a long tail type of flight. But use it with caution. That's all I would say. It's a helping pointer for sure, helpful pointer. So we can actually use it if we really, if we are sure about the bird, the size, or overall appearance, and the way that bird flies. But yeah, need to be careful with that.
Okay, there is one more request from Prasad. Session on identification of shearwaters.
I think shearwaters are fairly easy, I would say, except for whatever we get, except the case of a short tail versus sooty. I think, but those birds are very rare, and there are only a handful of records. So I think there we should be fairly okay. So we have a tropical shearwater, which is very rare, and then we have Persian shearwater, which we would have got in the last trip, which is fairly distinct. Then we have flush-footed shearwater, which is fairly distinct. Red-tail shearwater should be distinct if we get good views. Then we have a very rare short-tailed. Okay, so of course, streaked shearwater is again distinct. The sooty and short-tailed are the other two candidates. Over, we have got short-tailed sooties. There's only one record from Sri Lanka. They are very rare. So if it comes to that, then we need more experts to be involved. But otherwise, whatever shearwaters we get, I think we should be able to easily identify them based on what we know today.
Yeah, I think that's all the questions in the chat. If you
I had a question, Shiva. I typed it. I thought it doesn't appear. Can I ask it now?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Okay. Hi, Dipu. Thanks a lot for that amazing presentation. That's a lot of information. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. So the question was, especially I've been for 2 pelagics, and this is a thought which came to my mind. Taking video recordings, perhaps even slow-mo and all that. How useful would that be to distinguish one skua from the other in terms of their flight pattern, or the wing beats, or their erratic movements in the sea? I know there are other factors also, but do you think this will be helpful?
It is helpful a little. It's the same thing, right? As when you view it or when you view in a video, what you notice is something that is helpful, but we need to be careful. That's all. So I would say a combination of field observation plus stills plus video would be the best. But
Okay.
Worst case, if you get a couple of good still shots, and if they are showing the right pointers, some set of pointers that we had discussed today, right, we could actually nail the ID as long as the view is good and the bird was cooperative enough to give us the right pointers.
Sure. Okay. Thanks.
Thank you, Dipu, for the wonderful session, and thanks everyone for joining. And if any of us have more questions, let us discuss on the Coastal Karnataka Birdwatching Network. So we might come up more questions in the during next pelagic. I'll definitely send the skuas pictures. I think you're attending the next pelagic.
Yeah, we will hopefully meet them next week. Yeah.
And
I think sorry if anybody has expected that this is going to be a clean, easy pointer list of things that you can look and ID skuas. Unfortunately, these birds are so variable, as we discussed, right? So many of the pointers have to be used with caution because there are a lot of variations and overlaps between these. But there are a couple of things which are which can be used to say that with assurance that, yeah, this is this bird, like the leg color in a long-tailed adult, or a spoon-tailed central tail, spoon-shaped central tail feathers of Pomeranian, etc. But many other features are a little bit variable and overlapping. So, but if we just go through all those things methodically and look at each of these features one by one, maybe we if we see that there are a lot of features which are favoring one species and nothing which contrasts the ID, or there is a contradicting feature from the other species, then we could be more confident of our ID. But if there are contradicting pointers, that is when you may need to either go deeper a little bit or get better photos and do a deeper analysis, or we will have to just leave it as a Skua species. So that's how we can treat them.
Yeah, and photographing these birds during pelagic trip is very, very important.
Yes. Because getting all these subtle features in the field is sometimes difficult. Of course, if a bird is cooperative and it comes and sits near a float and near the boat, and then you can actually observe, and then it flies and comes back and you can see all those features, then maybe we don't need photographs. Maybe we could do the ID in the field, but many times that is not how we encounter them. So a couple of photographs and the field impressions could actually help us to actually get to the right ID. That's what we have seen till now.
Yeah. And there is one more session by Ramit Singhal on May 7th. Is the same time. We'll send out the invitation, Zoom meeting invitation soon. Hope to see you all in that session. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Dipu. Thank you, Shiva.
Yeah.
Thank you, Gopal.
Yeah, thanks. I see that
week.
there is a question about float plastic garbage. Yes, of course. Some of these birds like terns and skuas like to sit on floating objects. So whether it is a garbage or plastic or thermocol, for example, that is one of the favorite purchase for them, or anything that is floating, right? We have seen banana stems or floating on which and tube lights which were floating in the sea on which these birds perch. So some of these birds do like such perches. So that's a good time when you can actually go close to them and observe them. Yeah, thanks, guys. Sorry.
Yeah, bye, Dipu. See you next week.
Yeah, see you. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Thanks, Dipu.
Thank you, Dipu.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dipu. It was wonderful. Yeah, informative.
Yeah. Bye.